Welcome to Virtual Pathfinder YouTube channel. There are plenty of options when it comes to photography nowadays. Smartphones, compact cameras, mirrorless cameras, full-frame cameras, and so on. The question is, how many image sensor megapixels is enough? As I will show, it's far less than most people think. So what is the point with higher resolution images? Well, one can make a video out of one still image. How many megapixels do we actually need? In other words, how many image sensor pixels are needed for an acceptable image quality? I will dive deep into some images with resolutions from 10 megapixels to 64 megapixels and discuss the usefulness for these sensors. I will show some images and tell the story about these along the way. First, let's define what the main goal is when choosing sensor size. The main criteria is that the eye should not be able to see any pixelation in the image. We also assume the final image has been cropped to some degree. Apart from that, the required image resolution also depends on the size of the image in relation to the distance from the observer. Let's start by having a look at the limitations of the human eye. The optical resolution of the human eye depends on the aperture, just as any optical instrument. For a diffraction-limited optical system, the resolution increases with larger aperture. In daylight, the human pupil is about 4 millimeters, and one should expect the resolution to be even higher in dark environments since the pupil dilates. But just as the case with cameras, when shooting images in darkness with high ISO, The limitation is rather the sensor. The light sensitivity of the retina instead limits the ability to see fine details. The human eyeball diameter is about 24 millimeters, and as mentioned, the iris diameter in daylight is 4 millimeters. The physical resolution of that optical aperture corresponds to a resolving power of about 0.1 millimeter at a typical reading distance of 30 centimeters. That corresponds to a resolving power of about 254 dpi or ppi, pixels per inch. That limitation of the eye is the reason for using 300 dpi when printing on paper. Higher resolution makes no noticeable difference since we cannot resolve smaller details. The iPad Retina screen has a resolution of 264 pixels per inch, which is slightly higher than the resolution of the human eye. To go beyond that makes no difference. We cannot see any smaller pixels. The total number of pixels on a typical iPad screen is 3.5 megapixels. The eye cannot see any difference if the number of pixels is increased. So for an iPad-sized image which is not cropped, a camera with a 3.5 megapixel sensor would be sufficient. That is well below the number of pixels in most camera sensors today, including smartphone cameras. So why go higher? There are some reasons we may need more pixels. We'll get back to that later. In this video, we assume that typically an 11-inch iPad screen is used to view the images from about 30 centimeter distance. The same image shown, for instance, on a 27-inch screen may require twice as many pixels if viewed at the same distance, while a smartphone may require half that number of pixels. In general, big images are often viewed from larger distances than small images, with a few exceptions, such as huge printouts at photo exhibitions, where people may actually stand close to big images. Advertisements on huge banners far away usually have very low pixel density, but still appear sharp when viewed from a long distance. Assuming we intend to shoot photos the size of an iPad screen, then the eye cannot resolve more than 3.5 megapixels at typical viewing distance from the iPad. There are some reasons to go beyond that number of pixels. One reason is that images need to be cropped to some degree. Many boring images can become interesting when making the right crop. The interesting part of an image may even be at the corner unintentionally, especially in old images that are historical value to see the natural environment in the background of persons at the center of the image. Usually there are small crop adjustments, but in some cases it's good to crop an image quite a lot. There are also specialized areas of photography where one may want to crop out details. For instance, in astrophotography or microscope photography. In more normal situations, cropping between 25 to 50% of the original image size is typical. For that to work out without pixelation on an iPad screen, the original image needs to have about 2 to 4 times the number of pixels of an iPad screen, which is about 7 to 14 megapixels. Today's typical smartphone cameras with about 12 megapixel sensors fall in the middle of that range, making them a candidate for being the main camera for some users, at least from resolution point of view. There are of course other requirements to consider as well. Let's have a look at images shot with a compact camera with a 10 megapixel sensor. Here are some images shot with a compact camera from 2009. It's a Fujifilm FinePix Z300. The sensor has 10 megapixels and interestingly, I just saw that it was a CCD sensor and not a CMOS sensor. In any case, I magnified the images to see if I could see any pixelation on a 27-inch computer screen. The actual image has a 3:2 format rather than the 16:9 format of the screen, so the full image is perhaps more like 21 inches in diameter. That is still larger than an iPad screen. The first image is from a trip to Paris some years ago. It's an image of Pont des Arts, which is a pedestrian bridge over the river Seine. I can mention an interesting fact that this bridge has lots of problems with romantic couples. They have been attaching padlocks to the side rail and throwing the key into the river as a symbol of the love commitment. That was okay in the beginning, which was around year 2008, but it ended up becoming a safety issue. In 2015 they estimated the number of locks to be over 1 million, and the total weight of the locks was about 45 tons. That was raising concerns over the potential damage to the structures of the bridge, which made the local officials have the locks cut loose. They have protected the bridge side rails from lovers using plexiglass. In any case, at about 400% magnification, I could see pixelation in this image. That means that the image is cropped to an area corresponding to about 25% of the original size. That would correspond to about 2.5 megapixels. However, it was not that bad, but definitely possible to see pixelation at that magnification. At 100% magnification, no pixels are visible. This camera doesn't provide much control over the images, but the resolution is sufficient for most cases. Under the right circumstances, the image quality can actually be quite good. The next image is also from Paris. It's this Sacré-Cœur, it's a basilica, and when zooming in to about 25% of the original size of the image, it's possible to see artifacts in the faces of the people in the image. The roof and details of the building are surprisingly sharp down to the pixel level. Just as the case with the previous image, it looks good as long as it's not cropped down to more than half the original size, which is 5 megapixels. The next image is from a trip to the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa. This image is from Las Palmas, showing surfers riding the waves at a distance. Some of the images I shot were not so good, but the quality may be sufficient depending on the size of the final image. For an iPad screen, it is sufficient. The next image is of Giotto's bell tower in Florence, Italy. The tower is a part of Florence Cathedral. The construction of the bell tower was initiated by Arnolfo di Cambio, who died in 1302. Then the work was put on hold for about 30 years before it was continued by Giotto di Bondone, who was a well-known painter. He made the design and finished the lower floor during his lifetime. After him, Andrea Pisano continued, completing his design, but it came to a halt again in 1348 due to the Black Death pandemic. His successor, Francesco Talenti, completed the tower in 1359. It is an interesting building, and the photo is surprisingly sharp down to the pixel level. And this image shows that a 10 megapixel image is good enough in many situations. The next image is from Itsukushima, an island off the coast of Hiroshima in Japan. It was a cloudy day in late November several years ago. I went there with some friends. We had an Hiroshima-style okonomiyaki before going to the ferry. That is a dish sometimes referred to as a Japanese pizza. We took the ferry to Itsukushima. The torii gate was seemingly on land when we arrived, but when we left it was deep into the water due to tidal currents. The resolution of this image is okay as well, when cropped down to about half the original size, when viewed on an iPad. finally, I have two images of Mount Fuji in Japan. Mount Fuji is an active volcano and it had its latest eruption in 1707 to 1708. It is 3,776 meters high. I've been to the top of the crater rim some years ago in September, just before the routes to the top close for the winter. When looking down into the crater, it seems to be sleeping, but as mentioned, it is classified as an active volcano. These images are not shot at optimal conditions since they were captured through a Shinkansen train window, but they still look fairly good, I think. Especially the second image looks interesting with the clouds around the lower parts of the mountain. In any case, I conclude that a 10 megapixel sensor is sufficient for images displayed on a computer screen, even when cropped down to half the size. There is much more to say about image resolution, but I will finish this video here. In the next video I will make a comparison between this compact 10 megapixel camera and an iPhone SE2 from 2020 with a 12 megapixel camera. Then I will have a look at interchangeable lens cameras and some final technical considerations when choosing sensor size. As a conclusion so far, for images with the size of an iPad, a 10 megapixel camera is okay as long as the image is not cropped to more than 50% of the original size. There is also a lot to say about the optics and sensors, but it is important to keep in mind photography is visual storytelling. The technical side of it makes us impressed with the equipment rather than the photographer. Of course, a good photographer with top-notch equipment is the best situation, but there are compromises that can be made depending on what kind of photography one intends to do. I will get back to the resolution and image sensor size issue in my next video. Until then, have a nice week.